very warm welcome, everybody, to this evening's webinar with Sally Denham-Vaughan. Just to say a few words about Sally and her, her theme. She's going to be talking about what she calls her SOS model, the paradigms of will and grace, ego-logical and ecological self-organization. And she does a lot of work in this area in various different capacities as a gestalt psychotherapist, organizational consultant, and executive coach. And I'm very interested to learn what she means by ethical presence. It sounds exactly what we need, and to be able to reflect with her during her talk this evening. She's been working in a number of different contexts, including the NHS and leadership and change management. And she's also a member of the editorial advisory board from British Gestalt Journal. I have a very limited exposure to Gestalt. And her website is relationalchange.org, which is about better relationships, better world. And I think relationships, relationality, entanglement, non-separation, this is really what we need to understand better. Not only understand better, but actually start from there. Instead of starting from separation and wondering how we can put things together, let's start from oneness, togetherness, and relationality, and see what that implies for our own relationships and how we live our lives. So Sally, very much looking forward to what you have to share with us. And so over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jerome. An absolute pleasure to be here this evening. Very much looking forward to unfolding this conversation with you all. I'm hoping that we will create a shared learning field. As David has said, we often start from this position of separate individuals coming into connection. But I think if we just take a minute to tune in and really bring ourselves fully present in the moment, then we start to share an experience of being here together in this space. I will attempt to answer some questions in the chat as we go, and I'll leave little spaces for us to have brief sort of Q&A. But obviously there will be a break after about 45, 50 minutes. And then at the end, we will have live question and answers. So in order for me to get through and give you a good taste of the material I've got, I'll probably speak without too much interruption in this first section. I'm going to show some slides. As I say, if you can pay attention to remaining present while the slides are on, I think that will enable us to get a sense of this shared space. So I'm going to start the share of the screen, and then we'll go on. So that's the title of the conversation we're going to be having here this evening. And just transformational self-process, I think begins to give us an idea that we're looking for something that takes us beyond our general experience of being a single individual. And as David has said, I'm very fortunate. I get the opportunity to teach or be in this position where I'm the speaker quite often. But I want to reassure you really that I do this as an opportunity to learn primarily. So I'm hoping that we're going to have that shared experience of, although I'm the voice at the moment, that actually we're in this moment in time sharing a learning journey. And I'm going to be telling you a story. It is a bit of a love story about my learning journey. And I'm going to start when I went to university at 18, and I was preoccupied, like all good stories, and particularly love stories, I was preoccupied at that age, you know, being a bit of a damsel in distress then, with why do people do the things they do? I had grown up finding people rather curious, difficult to understand. And there was this new subject. I went to university first in the 1970s of psychology. And psychology then was defined very much as a scientist practitioner model and defined as the science of mind and behavior. I went to Edgbaston in Birmingham, and there was no doubt in anybody's mind that we were going to be observing the human and non-human world, looking really for measurable data points. So if somebody said, I love my partner, we would immediately say, how can you tell? And look for some observable behavior that gave us a sense of what that meant. And to that end, we created lots of metrics, statistics, surveys, and a lot of time with quantitative data where we measured behaviors in order to get a normative distribution curve. And the idea here was that in a clinical application, what we would try and do is move people more towards the middle of that curve so that they could function. More latterly in psychology, qualitative data and experiences become measured more. But even so, if you go to Wiki, as I have done this month, and look for the definition of psychology, you will see it is still held up as the science of mind and behavior. So just a very brief overview of what took me about 5 years. My very first lecture was on a topic called perception. And it was here I first encountered the work of the gestalt psychologists, who really were all about how we perceived these observed data points and then formed patterns that we could recognize and put a word to. And even now, I'm anticipating that if I say to you, imagine a blank piece of white paper, and now put 3 dots on that paper, for most of you, those 3 dots will have immediately conjured up an image of a triangle in your mind. And the same as if I say expand it now to 4 dots, the shape and the form will change. And as we begin to talk about, the slides moving even as we speak, as we begin to talk about these shifting forms, we can see there the whole idea that reaches right back to Platonic forms, that there is something embedded in our consciousness that enables us to reach for patterns that are laid down, but somehow available to us. I'll pass over most of my psychology degree, which then consisted of very similar sorts of observations, to when I began training in clinical psychology, when what we really did here was take a medical textbook of mental health, starting with anxiety, work our way through it, and learn treatment protocols using then what was the new gold standard of evidence-based medicine in mental health, which was cognitive behavioral therapy. And these approaches, really all of it to me, was characterized by a positivist or post-positivist materialism. In other words, if we couldn't observe and measure the essence of something, then to all intents and purposes, it was best to ignore it. And yet, there was also a focus on a fairly, a paradigm that I think we can agree comes from idealism, whereby what you see is seen to reflect your thinking, and your thinking but reflects the choice of what you want to see. Now, I spent most of my time at university studying alongside a course in miracles, which is where this quote comes from. So we had this interesting combination of factors coming into psychology at that point. I'm just going to stop the share for a minute. Whereby we've got isolated individuals displaying behaviors that we can measure, having issues and problems that are outside the normal, but the treatment really consists of changing that individual's mind, overcoming anything that has happened and moving them a little bit back towards the normal. So what we're missing, I think, in my training was any sense of connection, any sense of experience, and any sense of what I had originally gone into psychology to study. And I'm just going to share the screen for you again at this point, because I had gone into psychology, which again, I was told includes the study of conscious and unconscious phenomena, which sounded much more exciting than an observable data point. And in particular, I was fascinated by the origins of the word psyche, meaning spirit or soul. And there was a sense of a longing that accompanied my desire to understand. And as I look back now, I think that longing would be not just to know about people, but to have some meaningful experience of being with people. And this is where the love story really now changes to what I'm going to call a brief story of disappointment, but also of inspiration. And if we just come together, I had been training in psychology for about 7 years when I was carrying out a single case study with a woman who had what was called endogenous depression, which at that time meant that we couldn't find a real trigger. She was very unhappy. She slept a lot. She was a youngish woman, had 2 children, and somebody who had the thought, I should be happy, but I'm not. So sure enough, like a good CBT therapist, I set about deciding this was down to her negative thinking, which we could now influence and change. And we were going along nicely together. And then on about session 7, I opened the door and my client, without any hesitation, ran quite rapidly into my room and fell sobbing into my chair in the corner of my room. It wasn't this chair, but it was a chair very similar, and proceeded to sob without hesitation or interruption for a good 5 minutes, during which I had really 2 epiphanies and two main thoughts. One was, nothing in my training so far had enabled or supported or helped me to deal with people who were suffering and emotional. You know? And the second thought that I had, which at this point in time I feel rather ashamed about, was, what about my treatment protocol? Because of course I was doing a controlled study. And as in all good scientific studies, I therefore required the environment, all the variables to stay the same while my client changed. And the idea that life would intervene completely derailed my protocol. So here we are, nearly 40 years later, and I still think of my client with great gratitude, because she taught me a wonderful lesson, which was that while you might control your scientific study and protocol, life is going on and generally intervenes. So it was at that point that I began to search even more sincerely, I think, for something that would satisfy that longing for a soulful connection. And I'm going to just briefly now share some of the things that I searched for at that time. I was probably reading around that time the Celestine Prophecy, which was all to do with synchronicity. I found it very supportive. I'd studied Thomas Hardy for my A-levels, which was full of, everything's just about to come to fruition. And then the field moves, the life changes. And in the Celestine Prophecy, we got this idea of synchronicity, which was traced back in my sort of sense to this saying, which we're all very familiar with, God moves in mysterious ways. And I realized that although I was very, very attached to my psychological studies and the idea of evidence-based and safety and professionalism, I really did need an integrative paradigm that elevated a soulful connection. And I was very fortunate to have a colleague who reminded me, she said to me, in Gestalt, we say the field moves in mysterious ways. Had you thought of going full circle and studying Gestalt? And I hadn't heard of Gestalt. When David said he hadn't heard of much of Gestalt, I hadn't heard of Gestalt. I had a vague sense from my very first lecture that this was about forms and patterns, but I didn't know much about it. But I did embark on a training, and that training was probably the most rigorous thing that I had done in my life. But all of you will be familiar with certain aspects of Gestalt that have come into mainstream popular culture. And the idea of illusion, an organization of perception, is one of them. And generally in a very early Gestalt intro course, you are asked to look at these two pictures and say, what do you see? And if we look at the picture on the left, we might see the very attractive woman with the feather looking away from us, or we might see the old crone. And in the other picture, we might see two lovers about to kiss, or we might see a vase or a candlestick. And what Gestalt tells us is what we see is contextually dependent. If I'm feeling like a young and beautiful woman, I'm more likely to organize my perception to see that. If I'm feeling like I've just picked a bunch of flowers, we're more likely to see a vase than two lovers. So there's something about behind and beyond our observable behaviors, behind and beyond what we know, there's something that's going on implicitly, something that informs and organizes our self-experience in that moment. And really here, I'm just going to flesh out a little bit of a long journey, and then I'll come into the Gestalt model that I'm using today. The integration really was to look at what is the combination of psychology with Gestalt psychotherapy theory. I'll come in to say a little bit about that, but if we basically say that there are both implicit and explicit patterns that we recognize and know. We don't know them in the way that we can grasp an idea and give a word to it, but we recognize through our embodied experience. And these two paradigms are often polarized into idealism and materialism. Heidegger called them the facticity of our existence versus the transcendence, the fact that really through all our life, there's often a sense of something moving us along that can be described as a longing or a journeying. And one of the philosophers, phenomenological philosophers who's informed Gestalt theory a lot is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, French phenomenologist. And his last work was called The Visible, to which I say, you can probably recognize my psychological studies, and the invisible, which is this soulful longing, implicit patterning, that according to Merleau-Ponty comes together in a dialectic. These aren't polarities, these are a dialectical tension that are held closely together. And we always approach from one side or the other. So I can approach from the psychological, what I know and observe, or I can approach from a much more implicit, soulful position. And that together, there's a reversibility, a bidirectionality in that, but that is what we embody in our human fleshed existence. And that idea was so compelling to me that I completed a doctorate on the re-enchantment paradigm. I used a lot of the work of Anne Harrington on re-enchanted science. And, you know, re-enchantment is very much a paradigm that we use in Gestalt, we integrate, and we say that while there are observable, scientific, evidential facts in the phenomenal world, there is also the implicit interconnected paradigm. So I'm going to bring you up to date now with what we call the SOS framework. This is a core model that we use in relational change and really refers to, very simply, these three aspects of our existence that I've conjured here as self, other, and situation. Now, the important thing is to say, in the very moment that I put a boundary around any of these three, I'm really betraying the idea of these three, which, if I carry this forward, are always and already interconnected and always and already unfolding as a process throughout time. Now, if I just stop the share here for a minute again, and we come back together. The reason we used SOS as a model was very much that we wanted to be able to create something that was a shout out or a call to people, wherever they were in the world, whatever time, that we could say, what does SOS mean to you? And my bet is if any of you shouted out now, you would be able to say very simply, it means either a cry for help, you know, which is a reach for connection, or it means save our souls, which is equally compelling. And one of the things we know about when that call goes out into the world is that those are the times when people really move from a dominant existence in the sphere of their self to an elevation of the other, and often a demanding or emergency situation. So there is a shift. You know, if we think of times when an SOS call goes out, as David said, I spent a lot of my career working in the National Health Service. For staff who go out on blue light calls, there's often a sense in which you take your colleague as a real brother in arms who you trust in that moment, and you're going to do something for another person that is more, much more, than you probably could have done if you had planned that action. So there's a summoning of the situation, a summoning of the presence of the other. And it's really unpacking that I want to lean in with you here this evening, because that summoning of the situation that lifts us from our ego known identity into being able to do much more than we'd imagined is really the ecological or the more radically relational way of being. We use the term ecological now because many people have said, well, both of what you're going to describe are relational, They're just different forms of relationship. So sometimes now we call one egological. Egology comes from Husserl, who I'm going to mention to you, and ecological is the framing that we're giving to a much more interconnected, holistic, implicit and primordial way of organizing ourselves. And the miracle really of human existence is that we have the opportunity to do and experience both. And I guess the transformational journey that many of us are on is to come from the ego-logical, our plans, our actions, into a much more interconnected, holistic way of being. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about how this relates to Gestalt psychotherapy theory, which is really the most complex theory that I have ever studied because it's non-linear. And it combines three pillars of study, which are often studied separately. But of course, the magic of Gestalt is that we know that the whole that is formed is much more than the sum of its parts. But if we look really at these three lenses, our self-experience, our experience of being a person, which is where most of us live and we spend our lives in this sense of Sally, is best thought of as an experience of self, a sense of self. We often, the no-selfers will tell us, well, if you open the brain and look for the bit marked self, or, that it's very hard to find this. And yet, as humans, we have a compelling sense of a self. And it's a sense of self that deteriorates with dementia, deteriorates, fragments in trauma, in psychosis, and in different states. So that sense of self really is often for many people the pearl beyond price. It is our existence. And the curriculum that speaks most to experience of self is phenomenological philosophy. And I'm going to say a little bit about that this evening. When we come into relation with others, the discipline that enters Gestalt is dialogic theory. Mainly, for those of you who know a lot about dialogue, the work of Buber, but also the work of Bohm, the work of William Isaacs, where we talk about dialogue as nothing at all really to do with having a good conversation. It's to do with an attitudinal stance towards the other. How open and spontaneous are we in our contact with the other? And do we experience the other as something that I look at in a subjective, from my position, I observe them as a resource from which I can get what I need? Or do we enter into a different relationship with them where we unfold our being together over time? The third discipline that comes in here is field theory. This comes from the work of Kurt Lewin, and uses the idea of vectors and connection to analyze situations and see what the dominant needs that arise in any particular situation are. Now, within the SOS model, we say that when all of these combine, they combine in microseconds, in moments that unfold over time, to give us this sense of what we've been writing about recently, of ethical presence, that we are present in the world, not just in a mindful state of turning up and observing, but that we also have agency and energy that we can use alongside others and in specific situations to create particular shifts in consciousness, in systems, in groups. Of course, if we think of poles, the polar opposite of ethical presence is unethical absence. which is when I deny your existence, I don't respond to you, I'm able to view you not as a fellow being, but as a resource. And when we think of the paradigm shift, I guess, that we're needing now in the world, then I'm a strong believer that we need a paradigm shift from viewing other people and the planet as a resource into being alongside in an ethical unfolding. So that really is the framework for thinking about gestalt and psychology now. And I'm going to show you how these really can be summarized into what we can think about very clearly as ego-logical and ecological consciousness. Now, to do that, I'm going to focus this evening on giving you a taste of phenomenology. But if we remember that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, we would also get there through the two other entry points of dialogue and also field theory. But tonight we're going to focus on phenomenology. Now, phenomenology was originated by Edmund Husserl, 1931, and rather like psychology, when Husserl started, he was a mathematician, and he wanted a method of investigating the nature of existence and how we perceive things. So you can see the relationship here with the work of the Gestalt psychologists. And early theory, which was called transcendental phenomenology, aimed to identify and enhance your direct, immediate experience of the phenomenal world. In other words, to be more objective, or more properly, we would say, free of your subjective bias, and to come into immediate experience. So this is a great aim that Husserl had. And in order to achieve this, he had his students practice the three reductions, as they're known. The first one is bracketing, where all of us know that we have immediate responses, which we might call reactions to the phenomenal world. They can be loosely described as like, dislike, attraction, repulsion. But we all are socialized into not talking about those reactions. And Husserl said, well, yes, it's a very good thing. If I'm white and a person of color enters the room, then I need to put aside my noticing of that and literally bracket this, because by doing that, I put aside my preconceptions and prejudgments. The same is true. Do I like dogs or not like dogs? How do I feel about tall men versus short men? We all have preferences. Our preferences are our uniqueness. But Husserl said we need to put this to one side. Once we've put this to one side, then we begin to describe what are the phenomena then that are immediately obvious to us. And those of you who've had some experience in using this method will know that we say at that point, we just encourage awareness. So the practice that goes with this is of immediate moment to moment awareness. And this really now is being translated into a sort of Western mindfulness practice, is one way of thinking of this. The third reduction is to horizontalize, to drop any hierarchy of importance we apply to data. So in other words, when we see the three dots laid out on the piece of paper, we put aside the idea it's a triangle. We just describe the dots, and we try not to privilege the bigger dot. We try and equalize. Now, you can already probably feel somewhere in your body the effort of me even describing to you this process. And sure enough, not long after Husserl, Martin Heidegger, in his work that really gave us this ontic dimension, whereby we said, well, let's forget about getting to know the phenomenal world. What we really need to do, the epistemological dimension, we might call that, what we really need to do now is focus on being, focus on our experience. There is no such thing as an immaculate perception. And we can't bracket or objectify at all. That's not how we live. We can do that in a controlled environment, but mostly we live in a much more present way with life, where we are able to navigate, reach for, rely on much of our world implicitly. And this ontic dimension of being, really we can describe as a situatedness. We don't come from nowhere. We can't pretend we come from nowhere. There is no blank screen on which we write. We're always in a constant meditation concerning the nature of our interaction or contact with the world and ourselves. And for many of us, this is the foundational dimension in which we exist. Do I want to reach out into the world? Our individualistic paradigms tell us, or do I need to withdraw now? Of course, if you turn that on your head, it's, do I want to differentiate from others and be more unique and diverse? Or do I want to come back and merge and be more normal? So in some ways here, we begin to see that the psychological and the gestalt become entangled. It's a lovely word that you reached for early, David, is they become directional. Are we moving from isolated individuals looking at the world into connection, or are we all always and already connected? In which case, what we need to do to bring ourselves to the world is to be embodied, to be diverse, to bring our sensitivity and preferences. And those are quite different vectors of being. They take us in quite different directions. One takes us to a preoccupation with controlled studies and being normative. The other takes us into a much more qualitative discourse and being diverse. And of course, both of these are important. So if we think back now to, I put here, the ego is strong. If we think back to SOS, we accept that both the ego-logical, both what we are trying to put aside, and the ecological, what we are trying to bring in, are important. The SOS gives us a way of framing this. So if we just follow the red line for a moment, the ego-logical. For many of us in a Western socialized culture, the practice of development is quite what I'm going to call vertical. There's an idea that we will acquire knowledge, we will consolidate our identity, and that we do that through a process of education, of knowing more, and of being able to have socially harmonious, functional relations with other people. So for most of us, we have this body then of identity and knowledge that enables us to approach situations with plans, with agendas, with PowerPoints or slideshows, and a sense of what we're going to do in that moment. And that often is formative in how we relate to other people in that situation at that moment in time. It's very, Merleau-Ponty said that we live in the advent of being. We're always slightly ahead of the moment. If we're not ahead, then we're often behind, and with a strong sense of what have we forgotten, what have we not done, trying to catch up to the moment. But our sense of time and temporal location within it is often slightly ahead of the moment. What am I going to do next? What do I need to say to David tonight? What did I mean to? So I come with an agenda, implicit or explicit, I often come to the moment with an ego-logical sense of what should happen. Now, in contrast, different cultures approach this issue differently, and indigenous cultures approached it in a wholly different way, which was to really take a view of the world as intrinsically interconnected, whereby the situation calls forth what you need to say to the other person, and that will form your identity. So in this ecological model, where we need to attend is more horizontal. It's more what's going on in the situation, the culture, the here and now. And how am I called forward into my experience in that moment? When I originally began to write about this in about 2005, I, at that point, if I come back to the love story, called the ego-logical will, you know, where I have my will and I summon myself to impact the situation, and the ecological grace, where I was gifted certain things by the situation that led me to a self-experience. Now, these two are not polarities. They are entangled, and they form, at best, a dialectical tension, you know, where it's not that we need to swing from one to the other, but that each moment in time requires us to have access to more or less of one of these ways of self-organizing. And that moment in time is the unfolding of self as a process. You know, that's not to deny that I can solidify myself as a character with a personality that is fairly stable. And indeed, I need to do that to be able to go on in the world. But how I go on in the world is unfolded in every moment through my ethical presence, which is the call and summoning of the situation. I'm going to move on because I'm aware of the time. So let's just all take a moment to breathe, because I feel like I'm using quite a lot of big words here, but I'll just go on and say, you know, what I hope I've outlined for you is just, I've called it a sprinkle of epistemology and ontology from a modernist thinking, which is all entities are essentially separate, function through mechanistic ways of interacting. We've called that ego or will. The move there is to make contact from an individual, separate individual position. As we move more into the relational or ecological perspective, we come to think of beings rather than entities, beings as processes that are thoroughly relational, composed of and nested within contextual networks of dynamic, unfolding, and reciprocal relationships. Now, those reciprocal relationships are mutual. They're not equal, but they are always mutual. And that really is a more ecological state of consciousness that we can think of as grace, where the task then is to differentiate and diversify a field rather than normalize and homogenize a field. We can think of that as a paradigm of controlled studies versus less controlled, more generalizable studies. And in thinking about epistemology and ontology, we've really sort of summarized a whole lot of 2000 years of philosophy was about knowledge. We've then done about 50 years of ontology, which is the concern with our beingness. And more recently, Emmanuel Levinas, the phenomenologist, has talked about ethics as the first philosophy. And his movement is, okay, we of course need to know certain things about the world, but what we know is less important than how we organize our being. And Emmanuel Levinas, whose whole family were murdered in the Holocaust, says, well, irrespective of what we know and how we are together, what we need is an ethical attitude. And that this new paradigm that we're unfolding really needs to prioritize ethics and the ethical interconnection. What's the right relationship that we have with each other, ourselves and the world, rather than how are we going to be and what do we know? So I'm going to finish with a little bit of Levinas, who I thoroughly recommend. He has two wonderful books. One is Totality and Infinity, and the other is called Otherwise Than Being Beyond Essence. And here we're really coming into that gestalt notion of it's not possible to assemble consciousness. You know, it's not a set of data points that come together into a whole. We can't reduce it to that. There is a dimension that is beyond anything that we could possibly delineate and define as separate. So that sense of beyond essence, I think, gives us a really nice idea of what is calling to us through his work. So if I just summarize and go back to those slides, Levinas says that our experience of time, which is so fluid, you know, I've spoken to you here tonight about an experience with one of my early clients that's as vivid to me 40 years later as it was then, that taught me so much, that our sense of time is very fluid, that our language is at its most potent when it's embodied, that very little of it is verbal, most of it is gesture, signification between each other, vocal tone, affect, how we say and do things. And our own unique subjectivity delineates what he calls an essential pluralism, an experience of life that's not at all equivalent to a rapport between subject and object, but to a relation with otherness. And that our orientation to otherness is not just humans, it's all beings in the world. Levinas says that when we are moving beyond essence, this relation of other defies totalization. Totalization is Levinas's word for when we think we know for sure, when we have what Merleau-Ponty calls maximum grip on a situation. We think we've understood it, we've got that, and we don't need to worry about it anymore. It's got a tick in the box. We've commodified it. We can even roll it out as a product. You know, and Levinas says when we enter the ethical aspect of our being, we go way beyond Cartesian thought. You know, I think, therefore I am. We're way beyond that to an evocation of infinity, and that our longing for the infinite is, Levinas's word is, there's a trace in all of us. And if we think of our innate patterning, our implicit patterning that unfolds over time, that trace is experienced in our relation with what he calls indefinable otherness, which enters our consciousness through the call of the face. Now, the call of the face is one of Levinas's sort of mantras. It's a koan, really. And the call of the face isn't necessarily that I look into the eyes of another person or my dog. It could be a tree. It could be water. It could be a piece of sand. But whatever it is that I look at when I am here with that sense of the infinite, and rather than wanting to know something to get maximum grip and understanding, I want to experience it. The call of the face says, thou shalt not murder me. And by murder, what Levinas is really talking about is, do not use me as a resource for your gain. You know, do not kill me through your sense of knowing me or commodifying me into a product that meets your need. And in that call, we sense our ethical compass. In other words, that the ego-logical and the ecological give us a very different behavioral demand than commodification. In one, we are very much called to act upon the world in the ego-logical, to view it as a resource, to feed us. And that feeding can be psychological, can be energetic, can be physical. There's a range of ways that we get fed. In the ecological, we really understand that if we use otherness to feed ourselves, ultimately, we both are destroyed and destructured. And sadly, I think we're beginning to see with the state of the world at the moment that we need to use our agency as humans probably very differently to steward ourselves in relation to the world rather than to resource ourselves. So I'm going to finish with a quote from Kahlil Gibran, who's a great favorite of mine, who says in Sand and Foam, when you reach the end of what you know, you will be at the beginning of what you sense. And just to say that, you know, in presenting that, I'm also reminded of Fritz Perls, who many of you will know is the originator of gestalt theory, who said when he was over teaching on the west coast of California, lose your mind and come to your senses. So this really is to invite us into a much more embodied, sensual way of relating to the world. Okay, I'm going to end there. I'll stop the share. So I think we've done well on time. And I'll...
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Sally.
Pleasure, David.
I think your journey is a fascinating one because it's also emblematic of the sort of change of view that we need away from this objective observation and detachment, or rather the one-sidedness of this, as Ian McGilchrist would say. And what you finished with very much reminded me of Goethe. And in fact, I'm just preparing a talk which I'm giving on Friday to the Schweitzer Institute on love of life in Goethe and Schweitzer. And Goethe, he wanted this immediate perception, this delicate empiricism, he called it. And so you had to feel into and contemplate, not just observe. Observation for me implies detachment, whereas contemplation is union. And obviously these are on a continuum in a sense, and one's not trying to replace one with the other, replace completely the quantitative with the qualitative, or the object with the subject. But it's a lot more subtle and nuanced, which I think you've expressed. And I, just in the kind of terms of a scheme, as it were, because I think everything you said comes from, you know, the fundamental categories of our worldview. And worldview, Weltanschauung in German, is literally how we look at the world. And you suggested that we could look at it in a number of different ways. So let me suggest this is the conceptual, and the concept means to grasp. Capere means to grasp in Latin. Prehendere also means to grasp. And then we've got perception, but the concept, as you've explained, determines the percept, and vice versa. I mean, these two things are, but both of them are capere. And so capere is perception is literally to grasp through, whereas concept or conception is to grasp with. Then you've got the values that are implicit in what you said, you know, exploitation, resource, and so on. So the separation that you start with, which we identified right at the beginning of your talk, now the separation means objectivization, which means that you're inclined to treat other people for your own ends, and it's what you call the ego-logical. They're very, very, very nice scheme. And then, of course, you've got behavior that comes out of your concepts, your perception, your values, and your behavior, but that is driven at a number of different levels, as again you've suggested. And so I think we and this is what this platform was about, that we need to think as clearly as we can about these matters in order to be able to convey something clear and serviceable, as it were, for other people, because I think otherwise you're just in a state of confusion.
Yes, and I think just to underscore that, David, there is what we can think, but there is also what we discover through our relationships. Mm-hmm. that is beyond our individual ability to think. And I think that is where dialogue becomes so profound, and situated dialogue as an unfolding process over time. So I think when you've got those three elements coming together, phenomenology, dialogue, and field theory, and that's where the notion of ethical presence comes, in that how I turn up in a situation is informed through the SOS dimensions and will lead us into a different ethical relation with otherness.
And I can see how this would be informed, or there are parallels here with the work of David Bohm.
Very much so. Yes.
Setting aside presuppositions, yes. Dialogue, listening, space. Anyway, we're going to take a break now, a 5-minute break now.
Yes, a great question. Yeah, I think it probably does, because it was Merleau-Ponty who said that we live in the advent of being. It's like being and becoming. So we're slightly ahead of ourselves. And in that aheadness, it means that we anticipate and expect and plan, and a lot of our functionality in the world depends on us being able to do that, so what we use to plan, all of which is good stuff, we don't want to demonize the ego-logical, we just want to balance up the other way of being. All of that enables us to use the patterns that we've recognized and bring those patterns into the present moment. But it does mean that as we approach a situation, in our anticipation, there is probably an unconscious or out of awareness or implicit patterning that begins to arise, probably in the body. And the good thing about recent neuroscience is that all the neuroscientific research is telling us that's absolutely right. The first thing that happens is we get the arousal through the brainstem into the limbic system, up into the poor old cortex that thinks, oh goodness, what's about to happen here, and begins to, we might call it project. So those of us who have worked in psychology, psychiatry, any of those fields would say that's the transference that comes up from the past that stabilizes us in the present and projects forward into the future. But sadly, we're always a little bit more ahead, which is why mindfulness, etc., is always saying, come into this present moment. Drop all that pre-contact, pre-formation of what's about to happen, and be available to what is.
Yes, thank you. We've got a remark in the chat here saying, can you give examples of the levers in life, there's a mechanistic metaphor for you, that can change mindsets and perceptions and the potential impact on sense of identity? I'm sorry, my dog seems to be barking downstairs. I don't know whether you can hear her.
We can hear her. I'm
right.
relieved. I thought it was mine.
It's probably best to give examples from your practice, actually, and how this impacts identity.
Yeah. Well, if I think of my practice as a psychologist, it's very easy to see how particularly early trauma, developmental trauma, lays down patterns that are embodied and not so open to cognitive, in the moment, we can't press the pause button and ask ourselves, are we being reasonable? Because we get such a rush of adrenaline and chemical to the brain that all we can really think is we use the historic reaction. So what we know is the younger the incident has happened, particularly maybe pre-7, then again pre sort of 16, the more dramatically imprinted we are or patterned we are to react to situations rather than respond.
Mm-hmm.
So trauma is an obvious example, but that example is often lifted up now as the template for all our patterning, whereas of course we also have very good anticipations. And if I think of one of the most depressed people that I met in my clinical practice was a woman who had actually had an extremely good developmental experience. She very happy parent and had then had a traumatic accident, but nothing in her life had prepared her to cope with the idea that things wouldn't go well. So her anticipation was wholly positive, and in almost anybody's lives, part of our personal work, I think, the reason that so many of us engage in personal development and challenging dialogic personal development with others rather than just introspection, is that all of us have a story of either love and disappointment or trauma and hopefully reparation. The content of that is always different. And I think, that all of those stories are exciting and evocative, and it's possible to tell them and conjure up a great sense of the emotion. But the important thing, I think, in this is to spot the process principles that outline this journey, and they are to do with the earlier the pattern, the more dramatic the pattern, particularly, sadly, the more negative the pattern, the more likely we are to bring it to the present moment. And the more likely the trigger is to be embodied, not verbal, not what actually happens, but either an evocation of something that we don't want to happen happening again, which is the classic transference. But I think far less spoken about is if we've not had something developmentally, we don't know that we haven't had it, but we often have a longing for something, a sort of restlessness or a searching or a seeking. So we can't name what we want because we haven't had it. All we know is there's an absence of something in our lives that we are searching for. And it's in that sort of a moment that we really have to rely on the generosity of others or the situation to provide something that's outside what our mind, our individual ego, could possibly think about,
Yes, I'm reminded of a remark by Earl Nightingale when he said, our attitude to life determines life's attitude towards us, which is a very interesting kind of reciprocal. In fact, it was one of my students from my program, Inspiring Purpose, who put that in as a quotation that she liked. And then I'm, so that's, but I think then you might say that a more general attitude, I mean, just thinking about, coping, resilience, bouncing back and so on. And a lot of spiritual teachers tell you this, that life is basically about learning, that, but if you regard everything as a learning opportunity, whether it's positive or negative, then you probably make the most of things.
Yeah, I
mean,
if
it's not what you expect.
Well, there's certainly something about spontaneity, isn't there? Learning to respond to what is. And I think, if we listen to the great teachers of the moment, such as Ken Wilber or Thomas Hubel, and, really what they are saying is, we know that we somehow have to move beyond the healing of our developmental injury or lack, you know. Somehow we have to work that through and stop the searching for the perfect as much as the anger at the negative. So once we come into the present moment, I think there's often a sense of what now? You know, what happens in this next phase, which is the generative interconnected moment that I hope, you know, for those of you who like to read, if you come on our website and read Ethical Presence, then there really is something about what does that call us to do? And in that calling, what we've found is that there's often a need to look at situations such as power, you know, which I think is how we use ourselves in our relationships, privilege, which is much more to do with an out of awareness, situatedness. It just happens to be the conditions or country that we're born into. And what we know is that certain conditions of power and privilege gift us much more resilience, much more
yeah.
You know, so it's not an even playing field. And I think sometimes that, you know, that isn't perhaps fully recognized in some of the spiritual teachings, which are very much the individual journey within an interconnected matrix.
Yes, I mean, as you say, there are nuances to be applied to every situation. I'm just going to take this another question from Christine, and then we'll come on to Roger, because he's also put something into the chat. What's the role of the heart in achieving ethical presence? Is the call of the face possibly exclusive, ecologically speaking?
Christine, I hope I understand you, and perhaps if I'll try and give an answer, and perhaps if I haven't understood you, you'll come in, Christine. The role of the heart, I'm going to make an assumption, doing what I just said we probably shouldn't do. And the assumption that I'm going to make is that there's something about loving energy in the role of the heart. And it's pretty clear, I think, that when we become ethically present, the attitudinal stance that we have towards the other, if we think of it as an emotion, is that we love the other. You know, we love in a way that Levinas refers to as potentially substitution, which is we elevate the other to a position where they are potentially more important than ourselves. Now, you know, many people can get a direct experience of that with their children. You know, if my child has to have an operation, or I have to have an operation, you know, I'm going in. I'm going to be in there first. So we know that in a way we can explain some of this through familial ties. But what the call of the heart asks us to do in this framing is not just do these acts for our tribe, you know, but to somehow move into a sense of stewarding a much wider range of relationships, beings, trees, you know, resources in the ground, than just the people I am biologically driven to protect. You know, when we come into the moment and we experience that sense of love, my understanding of what Levinas is writing about when he talks about the trace of the infinite, you know, is that in that moment, which is often characterized by a sort of expansive quality as well, you know, that's why I think of it as horizontal. There's a horizontal dimension. The interesting thing is, where is that love coming from? You know, is it coming from the other in myself? Because for sure there is an other in me that is constantly emerging in the moment, you know, that is beyond the ego boundary. As I say, you know, why when we think of that SOS, all of us in certain situations are capable of being so much more. You know, we know we're capable of being much less, but we're capable of being so much more than we realize and know. So There's the other in the self that we can connect with. There is the real other in that moment, you know, those two people that you describe. And then I guess for many of us, we have an impatterned longing of this trace of the infinite. You know, there's what's manifest in this moment, but there's also what is longed for that calls us forward. You know, so that fluidity, you know, I'm really enjoying that yourself and Roger are talking about, you know, we have this incredible flexibility in organizing our perceptions as human beings. You know, we can reach forward, we can reach backwards, we can check in with ourselves. I guess the important thing for me as a practitioner is that we have some way of staying grounded so that we are able to orientate ourselves, because otherwise we can dissolve and fragment. And while for some people that's a delightful experience, you know, I know for many others it isn't. So there's something about how can we do that in a way that we can still self-recognize.
Again, it's also this continuum of action and surrender, of the positive and and this I think is one of the great spiritual arts of life, is when is it appropriate and in what degree? And in some cases, you know, it's like the serenity prayer, you know,
yes.
And be able to tell the difference between what you can do something about and what you can't do anything about.
Yes.
And so we're called to act, but we're also called to feel and receive and listen. I mean, life itself is this process of giving and receiving, of talking and listening.
Yes. No, it's wonderful. A colleague of mine in Los Angeles developed this dialectic of will and grace into the concept of engaged surrender.
Okay, engaged surrender. I love it. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Exactly what you're talking about. And you know, we also think of spaciousness, and I'm thinking, I've written quite a lot about what I call the liminal space, which is this zone of engaged surrender or will and grace. And then those people teaching at the moment on trauma will often reformulate that into our so-called window of tolerance, which is where we hear the neurological, you know, what our nervous systems can actually cope with.
Yeah.
Where the agency develops instead into a reactive, aggressive, dominating, pushing aggression, and the surrender becomes this chaotic, passive, sacrificial, you know, giving up on ourselves that we know leads to so much shame. So that's where we get these so-called boundary regulatory emotions of fear, shame, and guilt with the other, which you know, a lot of our psychological process is organized around dealing with those three.
You see, none of this really, as far as I know, is in personal, social, and health education, no PSHE. Whereas what we're talking about is the kind of essential human operating system that we need some input about this, you know, as young children, and I often say that, you know, that girls need to know that boys got a slightly different operating system and vice versa. I know that's probably a controversial thing to say these days, but it's then you can be sensitive, considerate, but at the same time know when you need to step in more decisively.
Well, I think you raised such an interesting point, because of course we are socialized, and we're socialized into all sorts of categories to do with what is success, what is happiness, what is a girl, what is a boy, you know, all there are, and all of that really is the blueprint that we then develop our patterns and reactions around. And for many people, you know, having worked as a psychotherapist, a lot of liberation comes from just unlearning some of that categorization, which in a way is the totalizing, the commodification, you know, I'm a girl, so therefore I should, and therefore I shouldn't. And, you know, and I think it is refreshing to think that as we I mean, you know, if I think of the 25-year-olds I know, you know, they're all experimenting with gender fluid and polyamory, and, you know, and not being so much in the socialized boxes and categories, perhaps, that some of us were educated into. So I think this new paradigm is unfolding. You know, I feel very optimistic about this. I think it goes beyond the individual psychological into something much more relational, much more ecological, much more mutual.
Well, that's certainly the desired direction of travel. Well, we've ranged over a wide variety of topics this evening, and I particularly appreciated the bringing in of continental philosophy and psychology, because this it's not évident, as the French say over here, that we're not always educated in Britain in the ideas of other cultures. And these are very, very fruitful, and I think you've given us a lot to think about with the model, the SOS model that you presented, and also to reflect on the implications for education. And perhaps I'll just ask you to reflect, give us your views on how you would modify the educational system, just as a last question. And I think we'll sign off for the evening.
Okay, lovely. Well, 2 or 3 things come to mind. I mean, in the gestalt field, we have a number of people who write about emotional intelligence, and that emotional intelligence is at least as important in life as, intellectual intelligence. And that really beginning to orientate young children to emotional intelligence and collaboration rather than individual knowledge and material success. So I think, some schools do that. We know that Finland, for example, is leading the way in terms of out with the curriculum, in with the support, and supporting what is a natural creative tendency and collaborative tendency in most children. And it seems to me that you would start there. There are obviously behavioral skills that you can teach as well. I think self-regulation, in terms of being able to get yourself aroused, energized through behavioral activation to an optimum level and keep it there, rather than swinging between adrenaline rush and collapse, which it seems we do a lot in our society. That sort of how to manage your energy seems to me to be a very important skill, because so much of what is called anxiety and so much of what is called depression can be very easily formulated as a sort of too much energy, nowhere to go. Fritz Perls called it the classic neurotic block, is you're mobilized, but you've got the handbrake on.
Yes.
Squashed in excitement. And so much depression is, well, now I've been in that state for too long, I've just flatlined. So managing energetic states is something that I would definitely state. So
this would be, I believe the UNESCO do use this term, education for being.
Yes.
Which is so being and then learning to live together. I think that's the third. There are 3 or 4 different elements, and so again, it's going back to these basic principles.
Yes, thank you so much, Sally. What a wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for your questions.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.